I have kept a ledger for 31 years. Not a diary, I want that clear. A diary is a man talking to himself and pretending someone's listening. A ledger is just weather and count. Snow, 4 inches. 2 beaver. Wind out of the northwest, mean as a landlord. Nothing in it that would embarrass a man if strangers read it after he froze. So there's no good reason for what's written in it on the 8th of February, 1894. Because that day I didn't write the snowfall. I didn't write the wind, though God knows there was enough of it to write about. I climbed down off my mule at the bottom of Bear Canyon, where the drift had come off the ridge and buried the road, and I found a woman on her knees in it, digging with a silver spoon. A spoon, mister, engraved. Her mule was dead under 3 feet of snow, and she was trying to dig it out with a piece of her mother's table service, and her hands had gone the color of raw beef. And when I said her name, well, I didn't know her name then. When I said ma'am, she looked up at me with her jaw set like a fence post and told me she did not require assistance. That's the first thing I ever heard her say. I do not require assistance. And in the ledger that night I did not write the weather. I wrote 4 words, and I've never crossed them out, and I've never explained them to anybody living. She kept on digging. Now sit still a minute, because this is a story about what a city does to a woman when it's finished with her, and it's a story about what happens after. And I'll tell you right now, so you're not waiting on it. Nobody gets rescued here. She wouldn't have allowed it. The spoon was the thing that undid me. I'd seen people die stupid before. I'd seen a Kansas man walk into a whiteout to fetch his hat. I'd seen a preacher drown in 11 inches of the Percha because he wouldn't let go of a Bible. Stupidity in the high country is common as pine, and I'd stopped taking it personal somewhere around my 40th year. But she was going at that drift like a woman clearing her own front walk. Neat, even strokes, lifting each spoonful clear and setting it aside, as though there were a right and a wrong way to excavate a mule, and she'd be damned if she'd do it wrong. I got down. My knees complained about it, the way they'd been complaining since Fort Craig. Ma'am, that animal's dead. I'm aware. Then what in the world? My trunk is beneath it. I looked at the drift. I looked at the sky, which had gone the flat gray of dishwater and was thinking about opening up again. I looked at her hands, which were bare and cracked at the knuckles, and shaking so hard the spoon rattled against the crust of the snow. How long you been at it? She didn't answer, that told me. You got gloves. In the trunk. I want to say I laughed. I didn't. There's a sound a man makes that isn't a laugh, that's closer to what you'd make if somebody stepped on your foot, and I made that. Then I took the spoon out of her hand. She let me. That's the part I think on. She could have fought me, and she looked like the sort who would have, but she let me take it, and she sat back on her heels in the snow in a wool coat that had cost more money than my cabin, and she watched me start in with the trenching shovel off my pack, and she said, very evenly, like it was a matter of no consequence at all. It was my mother's. The spoon. Everything. Her trunk weighed 160 pounds and contained, as near as I could tell, nothing anybody needed. I hauled it out with a rope and my mule, and a great deal of language I'll leave in the canyon where it belongs, and then I couldn't put it on the mule because the mule was already carrying flour, so we left it there under a pine with a stone on it, and I told her it would keep till spring, and she looked back at it 11 times going up the switchbacks. I counted habit. She rode. I walked. She said maybe 4 words the whole climb, and 3 of them were thank you, delivered in a tone that suggested she'd have preferred to say something else. My place sits in a park at 8,000 feet, above the last of the aspen, with the Black Range going away south of it like something that had been folded wrong. 2 rooms. A stove I've talked to more than I've talked to most men. A shed. A ledger on a nail by the door on a string because paper walks off in a house where fires need starting. She stood in the middle of my floor with snowmelt running off her hem and looked at it all, and I watched her not say the thing she was thinking. I gave her the stove-side chair. She sat down in it like she was accepting a chair from a footman she intended to have discharged. "You got a name." A pause, long enough that I heard the fire pop twice. "Vane." That's all. Not Mrs., not a Christian name. Just the surname, laid out flat on the table between us like a card she was daring me to turn over. And here's the thing, and I've never known whether to call it luck or the opposite. I knew it. Not from any acquaintance. From newspaper. I get my newspaper the way I get most things, late, second-hand, and mostly for burning. There'd been a bundle of Denver papers come up with the freight in November, 4 months old, and I'd read them one at a time by candle before I fed them to the stove, because a man alone will read a seed catalog twice if it's all he's got. Vane, I'd read it in 3 papers. I'd read it over supper and read it again while the fire took it. I didn't say so. I got up and I put the kettle on and I said, "Well, there's coffee, and there's a thing I make that's near enough to stew that the difference is academic." Her shoulders came down about a 1/4 inch. Later I'd learn that was as much as they ever came down. That night I wrote in the ledger. Feb 8, snow drifting bad in Bear Sin, lost a day. One woman arrived, mule dead, she kept on digging. And underneath, because I am not a good man, only an accurate one. Trunk full of nothing, hands full of nothing, look on her face like a house after the fire's out. Here's what the papers said, and I'll say it fast because she'd have wanted it said fast. Charles Vane, Denver. Silver, banking, and the kind of directorship where a man's name is worth more than his signature. Then the summer of '93 came along and took the bottom out of silver, and the bottom out of the banks that had been standing on silver, and Charles Vane went into his study on a Tuesday evening with the door locked, and a revolver he'd bought for a Colorado he'd never actually visited. That's not what the papers were about. The papers were about her. Because there were 400 depositors, and there were 3 trust accounts belonging to a widow's fund, and there was a great deal of money that had gone somewhere and could not be found, and Charles Vane was dead and therefore could not be hanged, and a city that badly wants to hang someone will settle. They wrote about her dresses. That's what I remember. Column inches on her dresses. What she'd worn to the Tabor. What she'd worn at the charity ball in '91, and what it had cost, and how many months of a working man's wage that came to, and they printed it in a box so it would be easy to find. They wrote the widow Vane declined to comment. They wrote the widow Vane was observed to be composed. They ran a drawing of her at the inquest with her chin up, and the caption said she looked proud, and I have thought since that there is no way on this earth for a woman to hold her face at her husband's inquest that won't be used against her. Cry, she's performing. Don't cry, she's cold. Look down, she's guilty. Look up, she's proud. They took the house. Fair enough, it was bought with other people's money. They took the furniture and the horses and a painting she'd got from her mother, which was not bought with other people's money, but nobody was in a mood to make distinctions. What they didn't have to take, they didn't have to take because it left on its own. The aunts, the cousins, the women whose children she'd sat with when they had scarlet fever, Mrs. Kavanaugh who'd cried at her wedding and who crossed 16th Street in January rather than pass her on the same sidewalk. 22 years of a life, and it went in about 11 weeks, and at the end of it, a lawyer named Prentice sat across a desk from her and explained, kindly, that there was one asset remaining that no creditor had bothered to claim, because no creditor thought it was worth the paper. A mining claim in the Black Range, New Mexico Territory. The Ophir Cut. Charles had bought it in '88 off a man in a hotel bar, the way men in hotel bars buy things, and he'd never once looked at it, and it had been sitting in a drawer being nothing for 6 years. She was 39 years old and she had a claim deed and a trunk and a train ticket, and every soul she'd ever known had made it plain they'd consider it a kindness if she'd go somewhere and stop being visible. So she went. And that's how a woman comes to be on her knees in Bear Canyon in February, with a silver spoon. She didn't tell me any of that for 6 weeks. What she did was work. I want to be careful here, because there's a way of telling this that turns her into a lesson, and she'd have hated that worse than she hated the newspapers. She wasn't noble about it. She was awful about it. She was the single worst hand I have ever had in my house, and she would not stop, and it drove me half out of my mind. She burned a pot of beans so thoroughly that the pot was a total loss. Not the beans, the pot. Then she scrubbed the ruin of it for 2 hours with sand while I told her twice that it was finished, and on the third time she said, without turning around, "I'm aware of that, Mr. Marsh," and kept scrubbing. She split her hand open on the axe the second week. Not the blade, the haft, a splinter the size of a matchstick driven up under her thumbnail. She got it out herself with the tip of a knife at the table in front of me, and she didn't make a sound. And afterward she went outside and I heard nothing at all for 11 minutes. And when she came back and her eyes were red and she said, "The wind," and I said, "It's fierce today," and neither of us was lying exactly. She had a hatpin she kept in her sleeve, pearl-headed. I saw her check for it maybe 40 times a day, a little touch at the wrist, done without looking, the way a man touches his tobacco. In a whole winter she never once mentioned it, and I never once asked. And I have never been more certain of a thing in my life than I was certain that pin had been the last object standing between her and something on a train platform in Denver. She could not cook. She could not chop. She could not read weather, and she walked in snow like it had personally insulted her. But she could count. Second week of March she was looking at my ledger, not reading it. I'd have minded that. Looking at the column where I keep what I owe the store in Hillsboro against what my furs bring, and she said, "You're being cheated." That's so. 15%, consistently. It's the freight charge. He's applying it to the gross rather than the net, and he's applied it twice in November. She turned the page back without asking. And this is not a hundredweight of flour. This is 80 pounds of flour and 20 pounds of a lie. I stood there with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. "Ma'am," I said, "how do you know that?" And she said, very quietly, looking at my terrible handwriting, "Because I did the household books for 22 years, Mr. Marsh, and no one ever once asked me how the numbers came out right." Then she closed the ledger and hung it back on its nail and went out to fail at splitting kindling for another hour. I should tell you about Sikken. Sikken and her son Nate lived 4 miles down and east of me, in a place you would not find unless someone brought you, in a country where the government had decided, several times in writing, that people like them did not live anymore. I won't be explaining that further. It isn't mine to explain. I'll say only that there were families in those mountains in the 90s who had made a study of not being counted, and that the arrangement between me and Sikken was 30 years old and had never once been discussed out loud. She'd bring me venison and take flour. She'd bring me a hide worked so fine you could have made a shirt for a governor out of it, and take coffee, and tell me, in about 6 words of Spanish and a look, that my roof was going to fail on the north side. Nate was maybe 26 and had his mother's face and none of her patience. They came up the second week Della was there, snow still deep. And I watched a thing happen that I've never forgotten, and that she never forgave herself for. They came through the door, they never knocked. Nobody in that country knocked. A door you had to knock at was a door that might have a gun behind it. And Della Vane went white and stood up so fast her chair went over backward, and her hand went to her sleeve. To the hatpin. Nobody moved. The fire ticked. Sikken looked at the woman's hand at her wrist, and then at the woman's face, and then, with an expression I would call amused if I thought Sikken had ever in her life done me the courtesy of being simple, she set the venison down on my table and said something to her son in Apache. He answered short. He didn't look at Della at all. That was worse than if he had. They took the flour and they left, and the door shut, and Della stood there in the middle of my floor with her hand still on her wrist. She said, "I don't know why I did that." I said nothing. She said, "I've never," and stopped and started again, and her voice had gone strange. In Denver, there was a woman who came to the back door with baskets every autumn, and Mrs. Kavanaugh said, she stopped a third time. "I bought two. I thought I was being kind. I bought two baskets and I told her they were charming, and I never once." She sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor in the middle of my cabin, in a wool coat that had cost more than my cabin. "I'm one of them," she said. "That's what's happened to me, isn't it? I'm not somebody they did something to. I'm just one of them, and I've only just noticed because it's finally me." I did not have anything to say to that. I still don't. I've had 11 years to find something. What I did was go out and split kindling for an hour badly, because my hands were unsteady, and when I came back in she was scraping the burnt pot again, and neither of us mentioned it, and she never touched that hat pin in front of another human being for as long as I knew her. It took Sicken until April to decide about her. I don't know what the deciding consisted of. Sicken watched her the way you'd watch a green horse, from a distance, sideways, over a long time, without any hurry at all. Della, for her part, had gone about it the only way she knew, which was to walk down there in a ruined pair of shoes and stand outside and say "I'm sorry" in English to a woman who spoke very little of it. Sicken let her stand there for a good while. Then she came out with 2 handfuls of willow and gave her one. That was all. No absolution, no speech, none of the sort of thing they'd put in a book. She sat down on a log and started splitting willow shoots with her thumbnail and did not look up, and after a minute Della, Vane, sat down on the ground next to her, on the ground in the dirt, and I'd have paid money to see the faces on 16th Street and tried to do what she was doing. Her first basket was an atrocity. It leaned. It leaked. It was, and I say this with affection, the ugliest object I have ever seen made by human hands, and it took her 9 days. Sicken looked at it a long time. Then she said one of the maybe 200 English words she had ever bothered to acquire. She said, "Again." And Della laughed. That was the first time. Middle of April, on a log, at the ugliest basket in the territory. She laughed till she had to put her hand over her mouth, and Sicken's face did something around the eyes, and Nate came around the side of the wickiup to see what the noise was and stopped dead, because I'd wager he had never in his life heard a white woman laugh at herself. Now I've been putting off the rest, and I know it and you know it. Because there's a version of this where a woman goes up a mountain and learns to weave a basket, and that's the whole cure. Where she gets calluses and God and a sunset, and the world is square with her. That's a lie, and it's a lie particularly beloved of people who have never lost anything. Here's what didn't go away. She woke at 3 in the morning, every night. I'd hear the rope on the bunk creak and then nothing, hours of nothing, a woman lying in the dark with her eyes open in a strange country. She wrote letters, to her sister in Providence, to Mrs. Kavanaugh, to a cousin. She wrote them careful, and she walked them to Hillsboro herself, 20 miles down and 20 back, and she never got one letter in return. Not one, in 15 months. And she still put her hair up every single morning. In a cabin, at 8,000 feet, with nobody to see it but me and a mule. She'd sit on the edge of the bunk with the light coming through the chinking, and she'd pin it up with hands that had gone hard as a teamster's, and I understood, eventually, that it was not vanity. It was the last piece of ground she held. You take a woman's house and her money and her name and every friend she has. She'll dig your mule out of a snowbank with a spoon, but she will put her hair up in the morning, because on that 1 square inch they have not beaten her, and they will not. I never said a word about it. I sometimes had to go outside. Which brings me to Hillsboro, and to the 22nd of May. She'd been going down every few weeks by then. She had a small trade, 6 baskets, ugly to tolerable, and a run of hides she'd worked under Sicken's eye and Sicken's silence. She sold them at Kruger's for less than they were worth and more than nothing, and she had stopped apologizing for the price. She'd asked me not to come. I came anyway, hung back by the freight dock, on account of a feeling I couldn't have written in a ledger. And a woman got down off the Kingston stage. Blue traveling suit, cut Denver. She stood in the road while a man handed down her cases, and she was looking at the storefronts with the exact expression of a person who has been assured she will find nothing worth looking at and is pleased to be right. Mrs. Holly's prentice. Della had her back to the street. She was at the counter with 3 hides folded over her arm, doing arithmetic out loud with Kruger, who was losing. The woman in the blue suit came in for a paper of pens. And she saw her. I watched it. I was 40 feet off with a wagon between us, and I saw every second of it, and I'll tell you exactly what happened, which is nothing at all. Mrs. Prentice's eyes went over Della Vane the way water goes over a stone. She took in the hair, the hands, the hides. She did not gasp or flush or whisper to her companion, or do one single thing you'd be able to call unkind if you were made to describe it in a courtroom. She simply looked through her, bought her pins, discussed the weather with Kruger, said the country was very fresh, and went out. And Della Vane stood there at that counter for perhaps 4 seconds. I counted. God help me. I count things. And then she turned back to Kruger and said, in a voice with not one crack in it, $11, Mr. Kruger, and you know it as well as I do. She got her $11. She got out to the wagon. She got up on the seat. She sat there with her back straight as a rifle and her hands folded, and she said, Mr. Marsh, I'd be obliged if you'd drive. We were 4 miles out of town before she made any sound at all. It wasn't crying. I've heard crying. This was a sound like something coming apart under strain, one fiber at a time, and it went on for about 1.5 miles, and she never once put her hands over her face because her hands were full of the $11. I looked at the mule's ears the entire time. It was the only thing I had to give her. At the top of Bear Canyon, she said, that woman held my hand at the funeral. And then she said, I'm sorry, that was self-pity. It won't happen again. And it didn't. June was good. I want that in the record. June was good, and I've thought since that whoever's running this business has a taste for arranging things that way. She got a decent basket. She shot a grouse and was appalled at herself for a whole day and then ate it. Nate taught her, without ever once addressing her directly, where the water was on the dry side of the ridge. He did it by walking there very slowly with his hands behind his back while she followed, which is a form of teaching I have come to respect enormously. She read my ledger and reorganized 11 years of it in 4 days, and told me I'd been poor on purpose. She said one evening out of nowhere, with the door open and the light going long and green across the park, I think I could stay. That's all, just that. And then on the 29th of June, 3 riders came up the switchbacks, and one of them was a deputy from Sierra County, and one of them was a man from the Sierra County Advocate with a notebook, and the third one dismounted at my rail and took his hat off and said, Mrs. Vane, you are extremely hard to find. Aldi's Prentice, Denver, the same lawyer who'd sat across a desk from her and handed her a worthless deed and presumably gone home to his wife in the blue traveling suit. He'd come, he explained, on a matter of some delicacy. He'd come because certain parties in Denver, men of goodwill, men who had known Charles, had begun to wonder whether the widow Vane had not been used somewhat harshly by the press. That a statement, correcting the record, could be arranged. That the trust funds, it now appeared, might have gone through a bank in Silver City, and there was a question of who had physically carried them, and that with the right sworn word from the right person the whole matter might be laid where it belonged, and a woman's name might be given back to her, and there was even, he mentioned, a question of a small remainder of the estate misfiled. Passage East, her name, the last of her mother's things. Della stood in my doorway with her hair up and her hands hard, and said nothing. And then Prentice said the second part. There'd been horses run off the members' range in April. 14 head. The Stockmen's Association was of the opinion, and the deputy nodded here, that it was a pash off the reservation, and that the whole nest of them east of the Black Range wanted clearing out once and for all, and that a case had been assembled but for one small want. A witness, a white witness, a respectable woman resident on that mountain in April who could swear she saw riders on the night of the 11th. Prentice smiled. He had a very kind smile. I've seen it on men who sell insurance and men who dig graves. You would only be required, he said, to say what you saw. And here is the thing, and this is where I'll leave it tonight, because I've got to go stand outside for a while, the way I've had to for 11 years whenever I get to this part. She had seen riders on the night of the 11th of April. I know because she woke me. I know because we both stood at that window and watched 14 horses go down the park in the dark, driven hard and quiet, and I know exactly who was on the near horse, and so did she, because the moon was 3 days off full and he passed within 60 feet of my door. It was not Nate. It was a man who had wintered in Hillsborough, and who worked for the Stockmen's Association, and whose employer, 4 months later, sent his lawyer up a mountain to buy back a woman's name for the price of a family that had taught her how to hold a willow shoot. Prentice took out a paper. He held it out. The deputy looked at his boots. The newspaperman uncapped his pen and got ready to write, because it was going to be a wonderful story either way. And Della Vane looked at that paper for a long time. And she said, "May I see the paper, Mr. Prentice?" He gave it to her, pleased. Men like that are always pleased when you take the thing they're holding out. They mistake it for the end of the conversation. She read it standing in my doorway. It took a while. Her lips didn't move, but I watched her go down it line by line the way she went down my accounts, and when she got to the bottom she went back up to somewhere in the middle and read that part twice. Then she looked at the newspaperman, who was young and eager, and had already written 3 words in his notebook. "You'll want to get this exactly," she said. "I'll go slowly." The boy grinned. Prentice's face began to change about half a second later than it should have. "On the night of the 11th of April," she said, "I was awake at approximately 2 in the morning. I woke Mr. Marsh. Together we observed 14 head of horse driven down through the park below this cabin, at a hard pace, in near silence, by 3 riders. The moon was 3 days from full. The near rider passed within 60 feet of the door where I am presently standing." The pen scratched. He was a white man. He wore a canvas coat with a torn pocket on the left side, and he rode a sorrel with a blaze. He had wintered in Hillsborough. I had seen him twice at Kruger's, where he bought tobacco on the account of the Sierra County Stock Growers Association. She paused. "His name, I believe, is Co." The scratching stopped. Nobody said anything for what I make it about 11 seconds. I counted them. I counted them because I did not trust myself to do anything else with my hands, and because a man does what he does. "Mrs. Vane," said Prentice gently, "you're mistaken." "I am not. It was dark. It was 3 days off the full moon, Mr. Prentice, and I have not been able to sleep past 3 in the morning since my husband shot himself in a room I was sitting outside of. I have had a great deal of time to look at things in the dark. I know what I saw." The deputy was studying the toe of his boot, as if there were something written on it. Prentice tried once more. I'll give him that. He was a professional. "Mrs. Vane, Della." He said her name like it was a hand extended over water. "There is nothing for you here. Look at this place. Look at your hands. In Denver you would be restored. I am authorized to say that. Restored. Whereas this," and he gestured, and the gesture took in me and the cabin and the mountain and the whole rotten, unprofitable country. "This is not a life. And the men who employ me are not patient, and there will not be a second offer." And Della Vane said, "I understand." She held the paper out to him. He didn't take it. So she folded it neat in halves, the way she folded everything, and she set it on the rail beside his hat, and she put her hands behind her back and she said, "I have already been ruined by people who signed things they had not read. I find I would rather not join them." The boy from the Advocate printed it. God bless him, and I mean that. He printed it in the 11th of July issue, 4 inches on the second page, under a heading that read Widow Vane disputes stockmen, and he got the torn pocket in, and he got the sorrel in, and he got the name Co in, spelled right. Nothing happened to Co. I want to be clear about that since we're being accurate. Co was not arrested or dismissed or troubled in any way I ever heard of. He left the country in September for reasons of his own, and I have not thought about him in some years. But the case died. Whatever they'd been building against the families east of the Black Range, it needed a white woman standing up in a courtroom saying, "I saw Indians." And instead there was 4 inches on the second page of the Advocate saying a white woman had seen a man with a torn pocket. You cannot hang a country on that. So it died. For 4 months anyway. I'll get there. The Denver papers picked it up in August. Now I've said I don't take a newspaper. That summer I took one. I rode to Hillsboro twice a month and I read the Denver sheets standing at Kruger's counter, and I did not bring them home, and she never once asked me what was in them, which is how I knew she knew exactly what was in them. They didn't print what she said, they printed that she said it. Widow Vane heard from, that was one. A comic piece, 3 paragraphs, about how the woman who had presided over the gayest table in Denver was now residing in a hut in New Mexico territory, and had lately taken up the defense of hostile Indians against the honest stockmen of that territory, and how some said the mountain air was thin, and some said grief did strange work on a delicate constitution, and some said, and here they got to it, here was the whole purpose of the exercise, that a woman who would perjure herself for savages might have perjured herself for a husband, once, in a matter of certain trust accounts belonging to certain widows. That was the trick of it. That's the part I've never got over. She told the truth, at a cost she calculated to the penny, and they used the telling of it to prove she was a liar. They had her either way. They always had her either way. The letter from Providence came on the 4th of September. 15 months she'd been writing to that sister. 15 months of walking 20 miles down with a letter in her coat and 20 miles back with nothing, and I had come to understand that the writing was not about the answering. It was a discipline, like the hair. It was a woman saying, "I am still a person who has a sister to an empty road." And then Kruger handed her an envelope, and I watched her face do a thing I have seen on exactly one other occasion, which was a man in Sonora who'd been told his son was alive. She didn't open it in the store. She got out to the wagon. She got the seat. She had it in both hands, and she was, I'll say it, she was smiling, the fool, she was smiling at an envelope, and she said, "It's Cora's hand," and she opened it right there on the box with a hairpin. It was 1 page. She read it in about the time it takes to read 1 page. Then she put it back in the envelope, and she put the envelope in her coat, and she said, "Mr. Marsh, the near mule is favoring the off 4. You'll want to look at that before the canyon." I looked at the mule. The mule was fine. "Somewhere above Bear Canyon," she said, "to the road. She's asked me not to write again. The children are of an age. There is a school. She says the name has followed them east, and the article about the Indians has done what the rest could not, and she is sorry, and she hopes I am well, and she is very sorry, and she asks whether I understand that she has children." And then, after a mile, "She was 5 when our mother died. I did her plates every morning for 11 years. That's all she said about it, ever, in 11 years. She burned the letter that night in the stove, and she put the envelope in the trunk. I never knew why. I have theories, and I don't like any of them." Prentice's answer came in October, and it was small, and it was legal, and it was the meanest thing I have ever seen a man do at a distance of 400 miles. The Ophir cut. A mining claim under the law of the United States is not a thing you own the way you own a coat. It is a thing you hold on condition of labor. $100 of assessment work every year on the ground, or the claim goes open, and any man may relocate it as if it had never been. Charles Vane had never done $1 of work on the Ophir Cut. Nobody had since 1888. She'd known that. She'd known it since Prentice handed her the deed in Denver, because she'd read the deed, and she'd read the statute after it, being a woman who reads things. She had not done the work because she had not had $100, and because in 15 months she had never once walked up to look at it. I asked her about that in the spring, why she'd never gone. She said, because as long as I don't look at it, it might be worth something. In October, a man named Skeen filed a location notice on the Ophir Cut, and Skeen was not a miner and had never been a miner, and Skeen did some kind of work for a company whose registered agent in Denver was a lawyer named Aldis Prentice. That was all. There was no letter. There was no visit. There was just a name in a book in the county clerk's office at Hillsborough, where she happened to see it, because by then she had begun to look at books in the county clerk's office, because a woman who is good with figures ends up in the places where figures live. She stood at that counter and read Skeen's name for a while. Then she came out and got up on the seat and said, "Well, they've taken the last of it." And then she laughed, hard and once, and it wasn't a good laugh, and she said, "They took a hole in the ground, Mr. Marsh, that I have never in my life set eyes upon, in order that I should feel this exact way at this exact moment. Think of the effort." I said, "Do you feel that way?" She thought about it honestly. She always thought about it honestly, which is the only reason I could stand her. "Yes," she said. The writers came on the 9th of November. Not for her. I want to correct something, because I've heard this story told back to me twice in this county, and both times it was got wrong, and both times it was got wrong in the direction of making it a better story. Nobody came for Della Vane. Nobody in the world was thinking about Della Vane. The case had died in July, and the association had let it die. And then in November, 11 men rode east of the Black Range because they had wanted to for 6 years, and they had finally stopped waiting for a reason. Sicken knew. She knew 3 days ahead. I don't know how, and I never asked, and I'd guess Nate had ridden down and seen horses gathered in a place horses had no business being. She came up to my cabin on the 7th, middle of the day, which she'd never done. She stood in the door with the light behind her and said something to me in Spanish about the north side of my roof, which she had been saying for 30 years, and then she looked past me at Della, who was at my table doing my accounts in a hand 10 times better than mine. Della stood up. Sicken crossed the floor and took hold of both her wrists, turned them over, looked at the palms, at the ridge of callus under the fingers, at the split across the right thumb pad that had opened and closed and opened again all summer. She said something. Nate was outside. He didn't translate. Sicken said it again, patient, to a woman who could not understand her, and then she let go of the wrists and touched Della's hair, the pinned-up wreck of it, done that morning as it was done every morning, with hands that had gone hard as a teamster's, and she made a small sound that I will not try to spell. And then she went out. There was a bundle on my step, willow, cut and split and soaked, enough for 4 baskets, maybe 5. Nate was already mounted. He looked at Della for the first time in 15 months, the first time directly, the whole time, and he had not once said a word to her. He said again. Then they went south, Sicken on the mule I'd given her in 1889. 2 grandchildren I hadn't seen come out of the trees behind them, which tells you something about how they'd lived. On the 9th, 11 men burned 4 wickiups and a brush corral and a rack of drying meat, and they shot 2 dogs, and they rode back to Hillsborough and drank, and the advocate ran a piece calling it a resolution of the difficulties. Nobody died. I'd like credit for that, and I don't deserve any, and neither did she. What her word in July bought was 4 months and a warning. And 4 months and a warning is why an old woman and a young man and 2 children were 60 miles into Chihuahua when the fires were lit instead of asleep beside them. That's what it bought, 4 months. She never once said it was worth it. She'd have thought that was an obscene arithmetic, to set 4 months of a family's life against a name and a passage east, and to announce that the sum came out in her favor. She just kept the willow in a corner of my cabin, wet in a bucket for 6 weeks, changing the water, until it was clear that changing the water was a kind of praying, and that she had better either use it or throw it out. She used it. Winter came down on the 28th of November and did not lift until March. I have wintered alone at 8,000 feet for 31 years, and I will tell you what I know about it. It is not the cold. The cold is honest. It is the sameness. It is 14 weeks of the same 6 sounds, and a man's own face across the table, and no news and no letter, and nothing in the world to measure yourself against. She broke in January. I'd been waiting for it since the previous February. I'd been waiting for it the way you wait for a horse to come off its feet on ice. You can see it in the shoulder, and there is not one thing you can do but be near. She'd been 3 days without speaking, not sulking, working, cooking, splitting, mending, all of it done well by then, all of it done in a silence like a held breath. And on the 4th night she stood up in the middle of eating and she said, conversationally, "I should like to know what it is I'm doing." I put my spoon down. "There is no one," she said. "Do you understand? There is not one living soul on this earth who would be informed if I died on Thursday. Cora would not be informed. She has asked not to be. There is no one to write to. There is no one to be for." She was very calm. That was the terrible part. In Denver, I was a wicked woman and a stupid woman and a woman who wore $300 on her back while men's savings burned, and all of that was true. And I have not defended myself once, not in any room. But I was someone, and now I am a person who makes bad baskets in a hut, and I am going to do it for 30 more years, and then I am going to die, and it will make no difference whatsoever, and Mr. Marsh. And her voice went, finally, after 23 months. It went all at once like a rope. I have started to think that they were right about me. I have thought about what a better man says here. A better man says something about God, or about the mountain, or about how she'd saved a family, though she hadn't. She'd bought them 4 months. A better man tells her she is good. What I did was get up and go to the nail by the door and take down my ledger. 11 years of weather and count. Snow 4 inches, 2 beaver, whined out of the northwest, and in among it, in a hand that would embarrass a schoolboy, every column she'd straightened, every error she'd caught, 15% twice in November, 80 pounds of flour and 20 pounds of a lie. I set it on the table in front of her, and I opened it to the first page. "There's a man named Kelso runs cattle on the Animas," I said. "He can't add. There's Kruger, who can add and would rather not. There's the assay office at Hillsboro that's been keeping 2 sets of numbers for 6 years and neither of them true. And there is not one soul from here to Silver City who can look at a ledger and tell you what it means, excepting one, and she is sitting in my house telling me she doesn't signify." She looked at the page. "That's a ledger," she said. "That's not a life." "Ma'am," I said, "it's the only kind I've got, and I have found it sufficient." And then I did the thing I am least proud of and most glad of, and I have never told anybody, and I'm telling you. I went and got the blank one. I'd bought it in Hillsboro in October, and I'd had it under my bunk for 3 months not knowing how to hand it over. Because there is no way for a man like me to give a woman a book without it, meaning 11 things I hadn't the vocabulary for. I set it beside the old one, cheap paper, marbled board, 4 bits at Kruger's. "Start it in the spring," I said. "Start it any way you like." She didn't touch it. She sat and looked at it for a long time, and the fire ticked, and outside the wind went over the roof on the north side where it always went, and I got up and washed the plates because there was nothing else on this earth for me to do. When I came back to the table, the blank ledger was gone. Neither of us mentioned it for 11 years. It's on the shelf behind me right now. In April, we went down for the trunk. It had been under that pine since February of '94 with a stone on it, 14 months, and the leather had gone green and a marmot had been at one corner. She stood over it a while. Then she knelt down in the pine duff. No hesitation now, not 1 second of hesitation. A woman who knelt on ground the way she knelt on ground, and she opened it. Here's what was in it. A silk gown the color of oxblood, ruined. A second gown, unruined, worse. Kid gloves, 11 pairs. A miniature of her mother in a gilt frame. A calling card case with cards in it, 40 or 50, DELLACOURTNEY Vane, engraved, which she took out and looked at and put in her coat pocket and I never saw again. A hairbrush with silver on the back. A packet of letters from a man who was not her husband, tied with a lace, which she did not open, and which she put back, and which was in that trunk when I looked in it after, well. And a canteen of silver, table service for 12, her mother's. 91 pieces. She counted them. She counted them out onto a horse blanket in the pine needles at the bottom of Bear Canyon, and I stood there and watched a woman count silver in the dirt, and the light came down through the trees the way it does in April, in bars, moving. 91. There should have been 92. She found the gap in the roll where the spoon had been, and she put her thumb in it. Then she said, "Mr. Kruger will cheat me. He will. Then I shall want you to say nothing at all, and to look as though you have somewhere to be." She sold 90 pieces of her mother's silver at Kruger's on the 11th of April, 1895, and she got $240 for a thing worth $600. And she got the 240 because she stood at that counter for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and did not once raise her voice, and did not once look at me. She bought a mule, a saddle, 2 blankets, a good axe, 100 weight of flour that was 100 weight, a box of pencils, and a room. Not a house. A room over the harness shop in Hillsboro, $4 the month, with a window on the street. She kept the spoon. Now I'll go quick, because the rest is 22 years and most of it is only good. She kept books. That's all. She kept books for Kelso and then for the Rafter Y and then for the assay office that had been keeping 2 sets and neither true, and she found what was wrong with the second set inside of a week and did not report it and did not use it, and the man who had made it wrong came to her and asked what she wanted and she told him, "Your business, at my rate, forever." She was cheap for 2 years, and after that she was not cheap. By '99 there were 4 ranches, the assay office, the bank at Hillsboro, and a lumber concern at Kingston that had to send a boy up twice a week. By 1902 there was a sign, which she resisted for a year, nothing on it but her name. Not Mrs. Vane, not Widow Vane. D.C. Vane, BOOKS. She got the offer cut back in '98 for $11 at a delinquent tax sale, Skeen having done no assessment work on it either, and she went up and looked at it. Finally, 10 years after her husband bought it in a hotel bar in Denver. It's a hole, 6 feet deep. There's a rusted bucket in it, and it is worth exactly nothing, and it is worth nothing today, and she has never sold it, and she will not. And when I asked her why, she said, "Because it's the only thing I have ever owned that no one else wanted." She never married. She'd have told you that was nobody's business, and she'd have been right. There's a thing between certain people that doesn't want a word on it, that a word would ruin, and I am 74 years old and I have never once been sorry. She put her hair up every morning of her life. And every February, every single February for 11 years on the 8th. Whatever the weather, she has come up that mountain and sat at my table and eaten a bad supper and gone home the next day, and neither of us has ever once said what the day is. Last February, she brought a Christmas cactus in a tin. It died, she knew it would, she brought it anyway. So, That's what I've got, and now you'll want to know why I'm telling it, since I've made a considerable point of being a man who doesn't. 3 days ago, a young fellow came up my switchbacks on a hired horse. Denver suit, notebook, 26 maybe. He had a card and I didn't take it. He said the post was reopening the Vane matter. He said certain papers had come to light regarding a bank in Silver City and the trust accounts of the widow's fund, and it now appeared. He was very pleased about this. He'd rehearsed it. It now appeared beyond serious question that Charles Vane's wife had known nothing, and signed nothing, and taken nothing, and that a great wrong had been done to a woman by the press of that city in the winter of 1893. He said his paper wished to restore her name. He said he had been sent to find out whether the widow Vane was living, and where, and whether she would consent to be photographed. 12 years. That's what it took them. 12 years and a lawyer's box of papers turning up in a basement, and now they'd like to give her back the thing they took, and they'd like her to hold still and smile while they do it, so it can be on the second page under a heading. I got up and put more wood in the stove, took my time about it. He waited, with his pen out, the way that other boy waited 11 years ago on this same floor. And I said, "She is living. She is in Hillsborough, over the harness shop, and she is 51 years old and hard as a wagon tongue, and she keeps the books for half this county, and there are men in this valley who cheat everybody they can and do not cheat her, and one of them told me last year that she is the only honest thing in Sierra County, and he said it like a complaint. She has one silver spoon and a hole in the ground, and a ledger I bought her for 4 bits. If you want to give her back her name, mister, you go down there yourself. Take the North Road, it's shorter. Go tomorrow. She does the assay office on Thursdays, and she'll be in her chair by the window with the light on the left. And when you get there, don't knock. Nobody in this country knocks. She'll be expecting you or she won't, and either way that door has been unlocked for 11 years, and she has never once in all that time asked a soul on this earth to open it for her. I don't know what she'll say to you. I've thought about it for 3 days and I do not know, and I have known that woman since she was on her knees in the snow with a spoon, and I could not tell you within a mile. That's the thing about her. That was always the thing about her. He left this morning. I've got the ledger open, the one she gave me, and there's the entry from 94 up top of the first page where I copied it over Feb 8. She kept on digging, and I've been sitting here since the light came up trying to put down what happens next, and the honest truth is I don't know how it ends, and I'm not sure I want to end.